Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation for the paper titled To Infinity and Beyond the Environmental Impact Minimization Paradigm. And this is a paper which has been submitted to the SIDS International Conference 2021. The authors of the paper are myself, so I'm Dr. Polina Baranova and I work at the University of Derby, as well as my colleague, Dr. Rosemary Horry. And also we have Colin Booth, who works for University of West of England. So that's your authors team, and we're pleased to present our paper and our study over the coming slides. Thank you. The focus of our paper is drawn to the environmental management systems as a way of very established approach in managing society-nature relationships and interactions. Environmental management system has a long established history, certainly in the literature as well as practice, and they are really designed to manage interfaces, but also above all to manage environmental risks by the organizations. It is still a mainstream approach, and I'm sure you're familiar with a number of environmental management systems. Perhaps the most highly profiled is ISO 14001, which is of international standard and well recognized and well established over the last few decades. Now, what we would like to do with our paper and our study is to re-examine the scope and environmental impacts that are generated by the environmental management systems. Because in our view, the scope and the impacts has been narrow thus far and focusing on some traditional and well-established areas, for example, like energy efficiency, water preservation, and so on and so forth. However, omitting some newly emergent risks and areas that need to be paid attention to by the organizations and individuals. It is fair to say that EMS are adopted on a voluntary basis and are certified by the third-party auditors. That has been really well recognized within the professional and academic literature. And what we also know is these particular systems are not really enforced formally in any particular sector or settings. Normally, they would be encouraged to, or there will be conditions of particularly, operating in a particular sector or being part of supply chains. But they're not really heavily regulated, and they're not really under legal requirements or regulatory requirements. They are, in its own right, really enforced by the practices within the sector. They're influenced by the market pressures to a certain degree, and they're also influenced by the peer pressures in the sector or industries. Okay, so what we also can see is that we can broadly define three types of environmental management systems, and they are international, national, and regional. And here you have some examples of those. As I said earlier on, ISO 14001 is the most prevalent, and perhaps you come across these particular systems quite often or regularly. At national level, schemes like Investors in Environment, ACON scheme or EcoCompass is again schemes that are purely focused on the UK and really looking at a very specific methodologies and approaches in encouraging pro-environmental behavior in organizations. And at the regional level, we also have region-specific schemes that are emerging slowly. Perhaps in our own kind of area, East Midlands, you have environmental quality mark for Peak District kind of businesses specifically. And one of the major differences is that these particular schemes are really working with organizations to contribute to preservation of a particular aspects of Peak District habitat or contribution to the biodiversity within the national park and so on and so forth. So they are much more specific and much more focused on contributing to the regional aspects of environmental performance. Now, within our paper, we reviewed literature largely on AMSs, and what we've spotted within the literature an emerging kind of and really a recurring scheme is that environmental impact minimization okay, is a prevalent adoption approach. So the systems are designed really to identify risks, environmental risks specifically, and then manage those risks and to minimize the impact of the organizations on the environment. Now, what we're also finding out that this type of adaptations fell short of encouraging ecologically positive responses. So what we're saying is that minimization is good, okay, but it doesn't really go far. And therefore, what we would want organizations to do is to see where there is a potential, there is a scope for these systems to take organizations in encouraging ecologically positive responsive. We also find out is that throughout the literature, which talks about EMSs, there are hardly any mentioning of the role of environmental management professionals. And there is also conversations about the impact of policy and regulators on a really adoption of environmental management systems, but very little is said again about the role of those parties in encouraging ecologically positive responses of the organizations and individuals within their operations. After reviewing literature on environmental management systems, we've come up with a concept of, if you like, it's a spectrum of adoption for environmental management systems. And what you can see here in this bubble over here, okay, I'm going to highlight it here, okay, in the green bubble, is our conceptual view that paper takes. So you have the spectrum of adoption of the environmental management systems from environmental impact minimization paradigm over here, which is purely focusing really on achieving economic outcomes through environmental impact minimization. And that's how traditional role of the environmental management systems are seen. To the spectrum, which is much, much broader, and we call it ecological impact enrichment paradigm, which really focusing on achieving ecological outcomes as opposed to just economic outcomes through a balanced approach towards nature, societal, organizational benefits. Now, as you can probably tell, there is a vast difference between those two paradigms or approaches in adopting environmental management systems. And obviously, adoption comes with also aspects of resource adaptation, as well as really looking at the approaches and methods of operations within the organization. We also think that parties like organizations themselves, environmental management professionals, regulators, as well as policy, has a huge part to play in the way environmental management systems are adopted, operationalized, and obviously the outcomes that are generated through their adoption. So I think from perspective of the environmental management systems, what we want to say is that there is this huge spectrum of adoption mechanisms from one scale to another. And what we want to find out is that, where organizations are at the moment, what are their positions, and if there is a potential benefits of moving to opening up of the adoption spectrum for EMSs towards their ecological contribution. And therefore, we asked a number of research questions. So there are 3 research questions that our paper tries to tackle. The first one is environmental impact minimization a dominant approach in environmental management systems adoption? Okay, and that's the question we're going to pose in our study, and we will report about the responses on the next slide. Our next question is there a need to move away from the dominant approach in AMS adoption towards more ecologically enriching impact? So if there is such a need, okay, we would like to find out what will be our respondents saying to this kind of proposition. And our third research question is, what is the role of individual organizations, individual management professionals, regulators, and policy in supporting the shift towards ecological outcomes in EMS application? So there are 3 research questions that our paper tackles, and they have been tackled through a very specific type of study design, which is outlined in our last bubble on the slide. So the study design is a four-stage research process, starting with a critical literature review, conceptual development, survey, findings development, and call for action. So that's your practical impact kind of based type of study. In terms of our survey, we approached experts, 21 experts, through the survey which has been developed through Qualtrics. Our experts are what we would call environmental professionals. So 70% of them had over 10 years experience in environmental management, and 80% worked with ISO 14000 as well as others. But I think ISO 14001 is really perhaps the most common type of application of their skills for our expert panel. In terms of the data analysis, we've utilized statistical analysis for quantitative data, and we also developed themed analysis of the qualitative data gathered through the survey. On to the study findings now. Just to say that at this stage, this is just a brief description of what we found out from the survey and the experts that we have approached. The paper has got much more fuller account of these findings, which includes other areas and our nuanced kind of conversations around the questions we asked and what the responses we've received and how we analyze those. But broadly speaking, if we look at the research question 1, the question was, is environmental impact minimization is still a dominant approach? Then the answer is absolutely yes. So from those experts that we have approached, 86% of them said it's absolutely right, and this is obviously a prevailing approach in adoption of EMS in a variety of the organizations nowadays. Our second research question tackled the issue of broadening of the approaches of adaptation of the EMSs. Specifically, it looked at should EMSs go beyond traditional areas and whether they are actually equipped to do so. So yes, our expert confirmed that 60% of experts said that EMSs really very rarely, hardly ever go beyond traditional environmental areas. So energy efficiency, water preservation, looking at the aspects to do perhaps with fleet management and so on and so forth, are quite a traditional ways of how organizations manage the environmental impacts. They're not very often consider things like biodiversity, conservation, contribution to the activities that supports obviously positive contribution to the national reserves or national districts and nature in itself. Those areas are not really looked upon as the areas where organization would want to go and contribute and manage those kind of interfaces much more proactively. Our experts expressed uncertainty about EMSs being equipped to encourage positive ecological contribution. What they said broadly is that as a system, as a framework, broadly EMSs can support much more ambitious objectives rather than minimization of the impact. But what they said, if organization or an individual has such aims, that would work. But if they do not, then I don't think that's really even on the horizon for organizations or individuals to tackle. It was interesting to see that 65% of the experts agreed the need to shift from environmental impact minimization to ecological impact enrichment approach in the EMS adoption. Our experts agreed that this is a valid approach, that minimization often does not allow organization to explore full potential of their contribution and to build much more meaningful relationship with the nature in the way they carry out their work and their business. Now, in terms of question number 3, where we were looking at really 4 major players, organizations themselves, we looked at regulators, policy, environmental professionals, and looked at how significant they are in really encouraging organizations to go for the positive ecological outcomes. And 2 things that really struck us in the looking at the data that came back and in the responses of our experts. So there was 2 major players, according to their opinion, that could move that particular adoption process forward, and their policy and environmental professionals. And some of those quotes in front of you signifies exactly that. So whilst the presence of the willing senior management helps, ultimately are the actions of the competent environmental professionals which add value to the environmental ecological efforts, not EMSs. So as a system itself, yes, it's fine, but actually it is those who use system, it is their skills and knowledge and aspirations that are quite significant in moving and adopting EMSs in a very specific way. Now, we're also seeing a lot of quotation, a lot of conversation about that the move from one approach to another should be really in fact at industry level and driven by the regulator policies. Because it's not enforced, because there is little pressure to move from minimization to the enrichment paradigm or approach, minimization will always seems to be a prevalent approach because businesses do not really interest in that area that much, and if they can really go through the minimization kind of approach, they will do so. So they feel, our experts feel, that there has to be a pressure from the industry, from the regulators, to really push out these types of practices forward. And here's another quote which really illustrates that particular position. Most businesses will aim for minimal compliance, as their core business and mission is not ecological enrichment. It cannot be assumed that they voluntarily adopt these measures without legal drivers. So, which is obviously paints a very specific picture, very cynical picture perhaps of our businesses, but it is so true. So I think there is a work that needs to be done by the policy, by the regulators, and perhaps by the industries and sectors itself, in terms of the professional bodies and in terms of the peer pressure to encourage organizations to move in this particular direction. As a conclusion to our paper, we draw a number of recommendations to the EMS adoption practices, but also other parties that we've researched through our study. First of all, I would like to say that our experts confirmed desirability of broadening the EMS adoption approach from environmental impact minimization to the ecological impact enrichment. And they've agreed that the spectrum that we have put forward, EIM, EIE, is a useful tool in EMS adoption. They would want to see a broadening of the focus of EMSs from just purely economic contribution towards ecological outcomes. Environmental professionals are very valuable in this process, and the paper suggests that the perhaps professional skills-based professional organization and support mechanism needs to be reevaluated to see if those skills and competences are enough and up to date to support a delivery of the ecologically holistic outcomes. Regulators are required to acknowledge their responsibilities towards the ecological conservancy and adjust their reward punishment approach from minimizing impacts on the natural environment to maximizing ecological gains. And obviously, environmental policies at regional and national levels have to develop platforms and mechanisms that underpin and direct business support towards, obviously, ecological outcomes. This will include providing funding, skills development, and innovation to balance delivery of the economic and broader spectrum of ecological outcomes. I hope you find this presentation useful, and we look forward to meeting you at the conference. Thank you very much.